I want to talk real quickly about why this building is still standing. And that is because a lot of very dedicated people from the community of Lincoln, from Roswell, Carrizozo, and from the state of New Mexico have worked tirelessly since this building became part of the Museum of New Mexico in 1937 to make sure that it remains a historic monument. And part of that legacy today, like I mentioned, is the Friends of Historic Lincoln, but also the Department of Cultural Affairs, which actually kind of sprung out of the old Lincoln Memorial Commission who put up these signs in the 1950s. And the current manager of Lincoln Historic Site is Mr. Bo Chesney, and he and his staff are integral in making sure that this historic site remains open and remains preserved and is just here for future generations. So as a community member, it's really nice to have partners in the state like Bo and his staff. So let's get the actual story started. April 21st of 1881, Billy the Kid was returned to Lincoln. He had been eventually captured in December of 1880, a place called Stinking Springs, and he had been moved to Las Vegas and then Santa Fe, then brought by train all the way down to Mesilla, and that was where he was tried. He had a number of indictments out against him, but the two indictments that he was actually tried for was first the murder of Buckshot Roberts, which happened in April of 1878 during the Lincoln County War, but his lawyer, Ira Leonard, was able to get that case thrown out. The next indictment that he was brought against him was for the murder of William Brady, the sheriff of Lincoln County, on April 1st, 1878, during the middle of the Lincoln County War. And that happened just down the street here from the courthouse. And that charge stuck. He was found guilty, and he was sentenced to death by hanging by Judge Warren Bristol. So he left Mesilla and was brought back to Lincoln County because that was where the crime was committed. They brought him to Fort Stanton. They passed him over to the sheriff of Lincoln County at that time, Pat Garrett, who was also the man who had caught him at Stinking Springs, and he was scheduled to die Friday, May 13th. This courthouse had only been a courthouse since December of 1880, just a few months. This was originally the L.G. Murphy and Dolan store built in 1874. There was no permanent courthouse in Lincoln up until that time. And in 1880, J.J. Dolan and Company, they went bankrupt. So they sold this to the county for $15,000, and they began the process of converting it into a courthouse. Now, Billy was one of the first prisoners that was brought here, so there was no jail. Eventually, they built a jail, a purpose-built building out back, and in April of 1881, Billy was one of the first prisoners to be brought here. While he was being held here, there were 5 other prisoners that were also charged with murder. They, unlike Billy though, they had not actually been brought to trial yet. The other 5 prisoners were treated very differently, and we'll talk about that as we walk inside. There are a lot of theories and ideas about how exactly Billy the Kid's escape happened. So tonight we're going to use a couple of very specific accounts, kind of try to stick to as much of the facts as we know. There really were only 2 witnesses to what happened inside the courthouse, and one of them did not survive the night. So the accounts that we're going to use largely come from a man named Godfrey Goss, who was an eyewitness in the back of the courthouse. We'll talk more about that. And from a man named John Meadows. And John Meadows claims that Billy the Kid himself came to his ranch a few days after he escaped and told him exactly what happened. And the details that he gives are pretty convincing. So we're going to base most of what we talk about off of those 2 accounts, and also Pat Garrett's account, which his was the official report, but as we'll talk about in a second, he wasn't even here when it happened. We're going to walk through the same doors that Billy walked through in April. He'd been here numerous times before when it was the Murphy Dolan store, but this time he was a prisoner. All right, onwards and upwards. How much of a transition period this was from being a store to a courthouse. When Billy the Kid was incarcerated here, this room we're standing in was still a store. We didn't even have a purpose-built courtroom here yet. It was a few months later that they would start actually renovating the room on the first floor into the first courtroom. So this was still in a major transitional period. And as we walk through what was originally L.G. Murphy's office when he owned it, this room in here plays prominently in the story we're about to hear, because this was the post office and also moving into what would become the county clerk's office. At that point, the probate clerk, a man named Ben Ellis, that was his office as well. And he's important in the story because there's a third account that came out just days after Billy escaped. And Ben Ellis is mentioned in that because the man who gave that report was with him. We don't know exactly who that man was, but most people believe that it was Sam Corbett, who had also worked for John Tunstall during the Lincoln County War, that he was the one who gave this eyewitness account as well. Pretty much these doors on the bottom floor, they were the only exits from this building. The staircase on the balcony outside, they were not there at that point. The balcony was there, but the stairs were not. So the first floor doors were the only way out, and that staircase that we're about to walk up was the only way up and down from the second and first floors. That kind of led to how Billy got here. This is a picture of young John Tunstall, Alexander McSween, who was killed during the 5-day battle, some of the so-called antagonists on the other side of the feud, L.G. Murphy and Emil Fritz, and then, of course, James Dolan there on the left, and later in his life. He survived the war and actually became a pretty prominent citizen here in Lincoln, was a treasurer for the county and a bunch of other things as well. This is the original tombstone from Billy the Kid's mother's grave in Silver City. The artifact itself is interesting, but I think the way it got here is even more interesting. It was mailed here by basically a custodian, a landscaper from Silver City. They were replacing it in the 1950s, and he thought, you know what, this is probably pretty important, and the museum had been opened here in Lincoln, so he put it in the mail and shipped it to Lincoln. So something that important of an artifact just got mailed, basic postage here to Lincoln. There are a lot of aspects of Billy the Kid's life in the Lincoln County War that, you know, we can chalk up to legend. His image has grown so much since 1881 when he was killed. And one of the things here in the courthouse that has become part of that legend is the famous bullet hole here in the wall. Unfortunately, this bullet hole does not date to when Billy the Kid was here. And I think the story around it is almost as interesting as if it was here when Billy was. So that was actually put here by famed artist Peter Hurd. He was part of the early pioneer preservationists here in Lincoln County in the 1930s and 40s. When they redid the courthouse in the 1930s, they did a superb job. It was immaculate. It went from basically crumbling and falling down to being a perfectly sound building again. And Peter Hurd, working with the husband of the curator at the time, thought to himself, you know what, this place looks too good. It doesn't look like an old frontier courthouse, right? We think of old westerns and things like that. We think of old falling down buildings. In reality, all the buildings in Lincoln in 1881, they replastered them every year. They restuccoed them every year. They kept, you know, you wouldn't let your house fall into disrepair. But us, you know, anachronistically, we like to think of these buildings as being old. Peter Hurd and the curator's husband at the time, he said, you know what would be a really good idea? Let's put some bullet holes in the walls to kind of give it a little bit more patina. I don't think they thought that bullet hole would automatically become associated with the legend of Billy the Kid, because it was the next curator that came in right after them that started telling everybody that was put there by the kid. So what they were trying to do ostensibly was make it look a little bit more authentic in their mind, and what it ended up doing was the next curator was like, well, that had to have come from Billy the Kid. And now the legend has grown and grown and grown. We're going to basically walk up the same stairs that Billy would have walked up to be incarcerated, and we're going to head through the room that he would have been held in and stop right there. Any questions? No questions? All four of you have heard this story so many times. Are you guys tired of hearing this story? Oh, awesome. All right. It was brought here April 21st of 1881. Now, this room, some of you guys are not standing in the same room at that point. So this room is actually divided into 4 rooms, all right? So there was a small room here, and you can kind of see where this white paint is. There's a room there, a room here, and 2 rooms on that side. Eventually, they opened the entire thing up to be the main courtroom here in the courthouse, but that was not done until the mid-1880s. So at that point, there were 4 rooms. The room where you guys are standing right now, that would have been Pat Garrett's office. And there would have been a doorway into this room here. This is where Billy the Kid was held. This was the room that he was held in. There was no jail at this point, no bars on the windows or anything. So he was confined to this room, and the only way to get in and out was through Pat Garrett's office. Originally, this had been L.G. Murphy's bedroom, and on the other side would have been Emil Fritz's sitting room and bedroom, but he never got to see that because he died before the building was even completed. So for the next couple days, Billy was confined here. Pat Garrett put in charge of Billy's confinement 2 of what he considered his best deputies. One was Deputy Bob Olinger, who Billy had lots of history with. Bob Olinger had been one of the antagonists and soldiers, if you want to call them that, during the Lincoln County War, on the side of Murphy and Dolan. And Olinger, among other things, blamed Billy for the death of Bob Beckwith during the 5-day battle, who Olinger was friends with from the Seven Rivers region. So there was a lot of animosity between the two of them. The second deputy who was in charge of looking over Billy the Kid was a man named James Bell, J.W. Bell, originally from Maryland. He also had some antagonistic feelings towards Billy, not as much as Olinger, because Billy had been at least involved with the death of his friend James or Jim Carlisle in November of 1880 up near Corona. There was a posse up there that had trapped Billy the Kid, and Jim Carlisle was killed. So, by all accounts, J.W. Bell treated Billy pretty well. Pat Garrett treated Billy pretty well. He even said that Garrett treated him well to John Meadows when he talked to him later. And Garrett and he talked a lot between April 21st and April 27th. But it was on that date, April 27th, that Pat Garrett made a fateful decision. And that decision was to ride to White Oaks to exercise his duties as the sheriff of Lincoln County, which included collecting taxes. There's a legend that he was going up to White Oaks to get lumber to build the gallows for Billy the Kid. There's no evidence to that. That's a story that came out later. But he was going up there to exercise his duties as the sheriff of Lincoln County, collect taxes. So it was at that point that Billy realized that now, where there were 3 people guarding him, now there were only 2 people. So also between April 21st and April 27th, Billy learned the routines of what was going on here. Because this was not a purpose-built jail, and that there were 5 other prisoners here that weren't really being confined, Billy noticed that every single day, for lunch and for dinner, Bob Olinger or J.W. Bell or Pat Garrett took the rest of the prisoners across the street to Sam Wortley's hotel. Billy was confined here. Pat Garrett made it very clear he was not to leave this room. Now that Pat Garrett was in White Oaks, Billy knew that at some point he was going to be alone with one of those jailers because the other one was going to take the prisoners across the street. So we come to the evening, about 5 or 6 o'clock, April 28th of 1881. Billy is sitting here. Pat Garrett is in White Oaks. The courthouse is starting to shut down for the day, because now it's the evening time. So the probate clerk downstairs, Ben Ellis, he's packing up to leave. Bob Olinger decides to take all of the other prisoners across the street for dinner. So now Bob Olinger, who has obviously shown a lot of animosity towards the kid and is much more prone to violence because he is a known murderer himself than J.W. Bell, is taking the other prisoners across the street. If there was any point in time that Billy had a chance to make an escape, he had to know this was it. The only people in this entire building were he and J.W. Bell, and they were in this room right here. Billy almost immediately starts his escape. We don't know exactly what happened between Bell and Billy. There's conflicting reports, but Billy either convinced Bell to take him out back, most likely to the privy, or he overpowered Bell here or somewhere in this area. What we do know is Billy took the opportunity to surprise Bell and smashed him over the head with his manacles. Most likely, he got Bell's gun from him, and that's at the point where we don't exactly know where and when things happen. The stairwell has always been the place where people say the action happened, and that's probably true, because Billy would have had the advantage, especially if he was coming back up. He could have turned on Bell, hit him over the head, and grabbed the gun. Pat Garrett said that Billy, on the way back up the stairs, he jumped a couple of steps in front of Bell, pushed open the door of the armory, which was right on the other side of the stairs, and grabbed the gun. That's definitely a possibility, but Pat Garrett wasn't here. He didn't know exactly what happened. John Meadows, according to Billy, says that they were coming back up the stairs, and Billy said that they struggled at the top of the stairs. He hit Bell over the head. He disarmed him. Bell tried to run down the stairs. Billy was laying on his stomach, is what Meadows said, at the top of the stairs. And if you look at the stairs and where the turn of the stairs is, if Bell was trying to get away and he was turning this way, it would have been exactly where he would have been shot right there. All those things, it doesn't really matter, right, how it happened. Because they were the only 2 people here, and Bell died. That was the important thing for Billy. He overpowered the guy that was watching him. He took his gun, and he shot him. And at that point, he was now the only person in the courthouse alive. And at that point, While Bell was stumbling out the back door, Billy grabbed Bob Olinger's own Whitneyville 10-gauge shotgun filled with 18 buckshot in each barrel. From the armory, he walked back over to this area and right to that window. So he came to this window because he knew that he had a perfect line of sight to the Wortley Hotel and where Bob Olinger was eating. So, and all of this, it's important to point out, happened in a matter of minutes. So Billy made a decision and he acted on it very quick. So we're gonna walk out through this door. We'll pass the armory where Billy did pick up Olinger's shotgun. And then we'll head down the stairs and we're gonna actually go out the door that Bell would have walked out of and fallen. And that's where we're gonna pick up the story.
Yeah.
So where you guys are standing is where J.W. Bell would have stumbled out of that door right there. And at that point, Godfrey Goss, who is a German immigrant who had been living here in Lincoln since the early 1870s, he was living in a small building behind the courthouse along with Sam Wortley. And Goss says in an 1890 article that he wrote for the newspapers, kind of giving his account at that point, although he definitely had given an official account at the time because Pat Garrett indicates that he had gotten Goss's account as well. But he says that he had stepped inside to pack a pipe, to smoke his pipe, and when he stepped out, he heard a scuffle and then 2 gunshots. That's what he said he heard, and he would have been the closest person at that point to the actual action. He said he heard a scuffle, 2 gunshots, and almost immediately J.W. Bell stumbled out the back door and basically into his arms and died. Now, Godfrey Goss would have known something about combat trauma because he was a hospital steward during the Civil War. So he came out, fell into his arms, and died immediately. And again, all of this has happened now in a span of about 2 or 3 minutes. So at that point, Godfrey Goss realizes that J.W. Bell is dead, realizes that the only other person in that building was Billy the Kid. That means he's now armed, and he's also not being watched by somebody, and most likely has at least got his hands out of his manacles. So at that point, Goss has a couple choices. He was a friend of Billy the Kid. He had been the cook on John Tunstall's ranch and knew Billy the Kid throughout the entirety of the war. He was no friend to L.G. Murphy and company. In fact, in another whole situation, he had testified basically against the character of Murphy. And this is one of my favorite stories of the Lincoln County War because Murphy had cheated them out of a bunch of beer. He actually hired Goss to run his brewery, which is about 5 miles down the road. And then after Goss brewed all the beer, he reneged on the deal and said, nope, you got to sell it to me for like pennies on the dollar. So Goss did not like Murphy, did not like the Dolan faction, but he was also an honest man. So his first thought was, I need to tell the authorities what is going on. So Bell expires in his arms right here, and Goss immediately runs towards where he knows Bob Olinger must be, which is around the corner heading towards the Wortley Hotel. All right, so we're gonna walk in that direction. So Godfrey Goss comes around this corner. At that point, this deck would not have been here, but there was a gate, a fence around this area, and one gate here and one gate in the front leading into basically the yard of the courthouse. So Goss comes through the gate, and at that point, he most likely can see that Bob Olinger is already moving across the road towards the building. And for whatever reason, Olinger basically chooses this door, the door into the post office or probate clerk's office, as his entry point. Most likely because if he came in there, it was the closest way to get to the staircase. Remember, there's no other way upstairs. So even coming through the front of the building, you would have had to go through those rooms we did. So he was heading towards the gate. Goss comes around the corner, and as Goss states, he got to within about a yard or 2 of Bob Olinger, right as Olinger himself came through the gate. He stopped and said something to the effect of, "The kid has killed Bell." And about that time, a voice comes from the window right here. And again, we have no idea what Billy said. A lot of people have said, what he said. Hello, Bob. Hello, old boy. But he got his attention, and there's a couple reasons why I think he got his attention. One, he really did not like Bob Olinger. But the other thing is, even if you're standing up there with a 10-gauge shotgun with 2 barrels filled with 18 buckshot, hitting a moving target is a lot harder than hitting a target that's standing still. If he calls out Bob's name, it's a pretty good chance that Bob's going to stop. And that's exactly what happened. So somewhere right in this area, Bob Olinger stops. He has just enough time to look up, realize that Billy the Kid is standing there with his own shotgun, and the kid does not hesitate. He pulls one trigger and fills basically the head and chest of Bob Olinger with 18 buckshot, killing him instantly and pushing his body back probably somewhere in this area. And the reason we know it blew him back this far is because after the kid shot Bob Olinger there, he came back out onto the porch and shot him again. And at that point broke his shotgun over the banister of the balcony and threw it down at him, basically in a sign of indignation. There's indication that Bob had basically threatened him with that shotgun over and over during his incarceration, so there was no love lost between the two of them. At that point, Godfrey Goss immediately started to run away, and the kid, according to Goss, yelled down to him and said, "Hey, look, I'm not going to kill you. I have no, reason to be upset at you, but I do need your help. I need to get these shackles off." And according to Goss, he went and grabbed a small miner's pick, which is basically a full-size pickaxe, but with a short handle, because if you're down in a mine, you can't use a big handle. And according to Goss, he threw it up to the kid through the window. He either did that or threw it to him on the balcony, but according to Goss, he threw it through the window. It's at that point that the kid has to figure out how to get those shackles off. And at that point, he ends up working for between 30 minutes and an hour to get the shackles off. During that time, of course, the entire town is starting to gather around this area. Ben Ellis and Sam Corbett, who were down the other side of town, they come back up because they heard there's some sort of hullabaloo going on here. And by the time they get back, the kid is now out on the balcony, basically talking to everybody in town, telling them a couple of things. One, I'm in control. He had grabbed a couple more pistols and rifles from the armory. He had killed both of his jailers, and there were no other lawmen in town at that point. Pat Garrett was in White Oaks, and the only 2 deputies were dead in the dirt here in the courthouse. So they got back, and at that point, Billy also instructs Godfrey Goss to get him a horse. So Goss does exactly what Billy says. He gets him a horse, saddles it up, puts a couple red blankets on it, according to Goss, and gets it ready for Billy to leave. So during this whole time, 30 minutes to an hour, he's still working on his shackles. During that time, he's only able to split the shackles in half. He can't get legs. So now he's got shackles around both feet, but the chain is split. He's managed to get the manacles off, and he's loaded for bear. He's got at least 2 Winchester rifles, a couple of pistols, and a couple of cartridge belts as well, one of which he takes the chain and stuffs into the belt to keep it from dragging around. So there's now a crowd of people out here watching all of this happen. Billy Burt, who was the county clerk at the time, it's his horse that Godfrey Goss brings up. Billy gets on the horse, and there are varying accounts of what happened next. Either the horse ran off before Billy got on it, or the horse threw Billy when he got on top. Regardless, he had to send another man named Alex Nunnally, who was one of the 5 prisoners here. He asked him to go get the horse. So all of this is happening in plain daylight, right, in front of probably at least 100 people at this point, many of them probably armed, and nobody does anything about this. And I think this is one of the most striking things about the story, because I think it reiterates why the authorities and Billy's enemies chose to move his trial to Doñana County. Because clearly, had they pulled a jury of his peers from Lincoln, there's a really good chance they would not have found him guilty for any of the crimes he was accused of committing. Not to say that he was not part of those groups. He was most definitely part of the group that killed William Brady. He was most definitely part of the group that was killed Buckshot Roberts down at Blazer's Mill. But there were a lot of other things going on during the Lincoln County War, and nobody else was being held accountable for those actions. So Billy mounts a horse for the second time after it had run off, according to Godfrey Goss, all the way down to the Rio Bonito, which would have taken a while to get it back. He, according to Goss, shakes the hands of a bunch of people who are standing out around the Wortley Hotel and the courthouse, gets on the horse, and trots out of town, reportedly whistling a tune as he goes. He went about 3 or 4 miles up the canyon, then cut north through Salazar Canyon, across the Capitans, eventually to Los Tablas, spent a couple of days there, then backtracked all the way down to John Meadows Ranch, which is down on the Penasco River. And there's a lot of people who wonder why that was the case. Most likely he was going down there to look for J.B. Billy Matthews, who he had a big grudge against. And that was actually something that came out in the newspapers right after he escaped. Their grudge was so well known that he was already being blamed for Matthews' murder within a day after he escaped. And it's 77 days later that he's tracked down in Fort Sumner and killed by Pat Garrett. So that is the nutshell of what happened that day. With that, we're kind of at the end of the formal tour, but I'll stick around and answer any questions. Thank you, David. I would encourage you guys, if you guys go back inside the courthouse, there's a donation jar there for the Museum of New Mexico Foundation. Every dime that goes to that goes back to the preservation of Lincoln. So if you guys, are feeling generous and want to support the historic site, that's a good way to do it. So, but I will stick around. Follow the Friends of Historic Lincoln on Facebook. Follow Bad Hoss History on Facebook. We have a lot of stuff going on, a lot of exciting things going on, and we're always looking for new ideas. So if you guys have ideas for us in terms of tours here or elsewhere, let us know. So I guess with that, we'll say adios, and we'll see you guys down the trail. So, all right, thank you guys.